everyone, my name is Discourse, and how about that Total War Warhammer 3, huh? Pretty cool looking, I gotta say. Well, I've been playing Warhammer Fantasy since around 2006, maybe? And it strikes me that not everyone is totally familiar with the background setting, with the lore, and with every faction in the game. And so, never one to deny myself an opportunity, I decided that today I'm going to go through every single faction in Warhammer Fantasy. Except then I got COVID and I didn't feel too hot and I'm still recovering, so instead what we're going to do is we're just going to try and get this out and we're going to cover the factions in Total War Warhammer 3. Which means that in the future then I'll be able to cover the rest of the factions, you know, for maybe whenever the new Immortal Empires comes out. And don't forget that Games Workshop themselves are coming out with a new game as well, the Old World game. That's going to be a miniatures game that uses all the old Warhammer Fantasy factions too, so this video should be totally relevant for that as well. Now, I'm not going to be doing a huge deep dive into the lore of every single faction, but I'm going to go through some of their tidbits, give you a bit of an idea for who they are, what they fight for, and what their history is. So that then when it comes time to either play that game or just for your own interest, you know who, say, Kislev are. And do try to stick with me here. I am currently recovering from COVID, so I might not be as full of zest and pep as I typically am. Although I feel okay. So subscribe to the channel, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/discourseminiatures. Let's just get those out of the way now and run straight into it. Let's go, Warhammer Fantasy. So then, what is it? What is Warhammer Fantasy? Well, it's this. It's this world, the world of Warhammer. It is similar to our own, but yet very different. It is a land of magic, conflict, and war. And this is probably pretty familiar to you if you've already played any of the other Total War Warhammers. Or if you're only aware of the miniatures game, you might have heard that this was destroyed, just kaboomed. And yes, that is the case. Warhammer Fantasy was originally a miniatures war game and Games Workshop ended it in the mid-2010s. And this was done during a big event by Games Workshop known as the End Times. A series of narrative events where every single faction sort of got capstoned off by Games Workshop and then destroyed, kabloomed with the world. This was to make way for the new fantasy version of the universe called Age of Sigmar, which is a little bit more fantastical, set in sort of a more ethereal world. But today we're dealing with Warhammer Fantasy, traditional and classic Warhammer Fantasy. So the world of Warhammer, it is a realm of magic and fantasy and all that good stuff, but it's not quite like the typical fantasy world, like say D&D. For one, most people in this world are going to die in the dirt, not knowing the face of their father. It's just a fact of life. There's very little heroism in this world in the traditional sense, though there's a lot of big f***off hammers. And if you will excuse me, I'll read from the tome for this next one. Prepare thyself to enter a world of demons and vile sorcery, of battle and death, of violence and of madness. Chaos infects the world like a malignant disease from which there can be no recovery. Logic, reason, and sanity have no place here. Even the earth and the air are suffused with the stuff of raw magic, causing gnarled hag trees to come alive, men to devolve into monsters, and castles of bone to form from the mass graves of ancient battles. In this blasted realm, you will see wonders and horror alike that you shall carry to the grave. So yeah, it's pretty rough. So it is a gritty and desolate world, but it's not quite low fantasy the way that, say, Song of Ice and Fire is. There's a lot of magic here. And one of the things about Warhammer is that it is always teetering on the edge of destruction. There's always an apocalypse going on. And yet, all the same, everyone's too busy trying to build grand empires, fighting battles, or just rob the guy next to him to really sort of care or notice. But not to worry, there are plenty of people willing to burn wizards at the stake in order to save the world. There's lots of those guys around, so, you know, someone's kind of trying to look after the planet. And with good reason too, by the way. Those wizards can indeed be a font for actual demons to come spiraling into the world. So even if they are innocent, they still gotta get burned. Maybe. It's a pretty dark place. This was the OG Grimdark, before Warhammer 40k. The scale is a little bit smaller, but it's a lot more personal because of that. And there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in this world, between vampire pirates that are sailing the seas to massive immortal warriors who stream from the roof of the world. hell-bent on destroying the entire planet for the glory of their dark gods. Yeah, these guys were the White Walkers before it was cool, and then subsequently not cool anymore. You've got fantasy Germany, who are currently undergoing an industrial revolution. Meanwhile, there are knights atop Pegasi flying around in fantasy France, fighting giant lizard dinosaur men. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and it's pretty all fantastic. It's basically the real world in 1500, except dialed up to like 22. There's magic, you've got guns, and you got halflings. What more could you want? Oh, and of course, there's shit. Just shit everywhere. There's no indoor plumbing here. What did you expect? Although there is a vast underground empire of rat men who are waiting for the day to ascend to the surface and take over the world. Why will no one listen to me? There are rat people beneath our feet. They're known as the Skaven, and one of their plans to take over the surface world is to literally get a giant magnet gun and pull the moon into the planet's surface itself and just destroy it. It's fantastic. It's brilliant. It works in the end times. So that's Warhammer Fantasy, the OG Warhammer, the thing that invented Grimdark before 40k even existed. It's exactly like 40k, except the scale is a lot smaller, but all that means is that you'll get to see the face of the dwarf that stabs you. And the stakes will likely be a lot lower than Warhammer 40k, because the reason that you've been stabbed is that your great-great-grandfather probably stiffed that dwarf's great-grandfather out of a couple of coppers. Dwarves really take those sorts of grudges very, very seriously in this setting. It's a whole thing. So obviously we've touched on a lot of factions here, just describing the setting, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to start in the northeast section of a place known as the Old World. The Old World is basically fantasy Europe. And the Old World was the focus of the original Warhammer Fantasy game, having been made by a couple of guys in the UK. Although ironically, Albion, which is the fantasy UK equivalent in this world, doesn't get a lot of coverage, not a lot going on there. There's some stuff going on there, but we're not going to be covering it right now. It mostly just rains. Okay, so we're in the northeast of the Old World. This is where the majority of Total War Warhammer 3 is taking place. That and the far north as well, which we'll also be touching on. And because I said I'd be covering every single faction in Warhammer Fantasy, and yet I still need to do everything in the most convoluted way possible, let's start with the one faction that was never actually a real faction in Warhammer Fantasy itself, but will be in Total War Warhammer 3. Let's start with Kislev.
Kislev.
This is the kingdom of Kislev, the land of bears and ice. And while they weren't a traditional faction in Warhammer Fantasy, they had always been suggested, there'd always been an idea of what they were. We all knew, their thing. And they will also be in the new miniatures game being produced by Games Workshop that covers the old Warhammer Fantasy game. That's called the Old World, so don't confuse it with the continent. The Old World, that's gonna get confusing real fast. But in any case, if you've been online recently at all, you've likely seen a cartoon caveman say something to the effect of, "Hard times make strong men." While that's not quite true, the Kingdom of Kislev is one of the strongest, most compelling arguments you could find in favor of that. So hailing from the northeast, they have been one of the biggest buffers against chaos, i.e. the big baddies of the setting, and the rest of the Old World. So it's only by their continued perseverance and grit that we're able to just hang out in pubs, and Kislevites will never let you forget that. Now Kislev is a little bit more complicated than just bears and ice, but Creative Assembly, they have focused pretty hard on those two twin pillars. Now, for Kislev itself, there are indeed bears. The previous Tsar, i.e. the king, did indeed ride around on a bear. As a side note, that bear was called Erskine, which translates to Brother Bear, which is just lovely. Now the main god for Kislev is a great bear god called Urson. And it's exactly what you think it is, and it receives the majority of worship from the Kislevites. And as a side note, if you ever find yourself in the Warhammer role-playing game and you have the opportunity to play a Kislevite animal tamer, take it. Because you get to start with an actual goddamn bear as your pet, whereas your weak-willed Western friends will have to settle for a small, angry dog. Bear every time. And of course, it is Kislev, there is also ice. There is a lot of ice. There is the most ice. And so as a result of this, the main magical tradition in Kislev is the Sisterhood of Ice Witches. And they are a secretive organization, and it is said that they can manipulate the ice that flows through Kislev itself. Now, they're not just witches, they don't just have great magical power, they also have great political power as well. And it's said that they have infiltrated almost every single institution in Kislevite society. In fact, the current ruler of Kislev is an ice witch. Now, ice witches maintain an absolute monopoly on magic in Kislevite society. It is said that there may one day be a male ice witch who is born and will utterly corrupt ice magic in Kislev, so the ice witches ruthlessly hunt down any male wizards in their society. This is the future liberals want. Now, that's not everything that there is to Kislev. They aren't just bears and ice, they've got a little bit more going on. And their armies can be very varied, in fact, and that's because there are two main cultural distinctions within Kislev. So you have the northern Ungles and the southern Gospodars. So without the Ungles, the Kislevites wouldn't have their horse archers and infantry Kossars. And without the wealth of the Gospodars, they wouldn't have the elite Streltsy or their winged Lancers. And it's only by the virtue of these heavily armored cavalry, the winged Lancers, that Kislev stands up against forces like Chaos. And the winged Lancers could even go toe-to-toe with the elite cavalry of a place like Bretonnia. Additionally, if you're like me at all, you also know someone who will always play Sabatons when the winged Hussars arrive, any moment that the winged Lancers show up in anything. But this all makes sense because the Kislevites do have a history of being steppe peoples. So while it might feel a little easy to say that every single place in Warhammer Fantasy has a real world equivalent, so for example, the Empire is basically Fantasy Germany, Bretonnia is Fantasy France, Kislev would be very similar to Russia. But there's a big Slavic stew going on here and a little bit of Mongolia thrown in as well. So there's a lot going on with Kislev and its cultural influences. And unlike the Russians, they aren't so much defined as struggling against the weather in their native biome, but rather struggling against actual demons of chaos. I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be said that chaos represents real world hardship or whatever. Not in this video though. Kislev itself is run by a Tsarina Katerin Boka at the moment, who is also an ice witch. She's clearly a parallel to Catherine the Great. But at the local level, individual towns have local boyars who will make most of the decisions. Kislev is such a huge sprawling place and it's so sparsely populated that it's not really possible to have a sort of centralized government to govern everything. Now, Tsarina Katerin is the daughter of the beloved Boris Boka, who was also known as the Red Tsar. Katerin is literally an ice queen. She has a throne made of ice. I mean, personally, I prefer central heating, but okay. And she commands great respect from her people. She's not as charismatic or fun to be around as Boris, her father, was, but she is quite stern, quite certain, and quite severe as well. Imagine Elsa from Frozen, but only putting a lot more heads on spikes. So that's Kislev. They are a cold, hard, complex people, more than just bears and ice. They have a fire, strength, and a pride to them, and they won't let you forget that. Okay, and next up we've got Ogre Kingdoms. Oh boy. So it is almost dinner time here. Very appropriate. So many of the factions in Warhammer Fantasy come from a very specific psychology formed by major events in their history. Bretonnia is known as a pretty haughty society overall in order to keep their peasants in line. Kislev, again, has a lot of grit and determination because they're always being attacked by, hordes of ravening chaos demons. For the ogres, it's a big hole in the ground, and they're always hungry. Okay, this needs to be explained. So originally, ogres were pretty simple people. They lived a nomadic life in the steppes to the east of the Kislevites. In real world terms, think of them as sort of occupying the space of Mongolia. So they are bumping up right against Cathay. And it's said that Cathay actually taught them the secrets of metal and fire. So not too bad, those are pretty banging things. However, unfortunately, the ogres began to overrun the steppe. These guys are big boys, and that was becoming a real issue for Cathay. Now, once their numbers grew really big, coincidentally, a massive meteor fell from the sky right into the ogre ancestral lands. And this basically wiped out everything for miles all around it as it crashed into the earth. And it is speculated that the Dragon Emperor of Cathay may have been involved. This could have been an inside job. Now, once the dust had cleared, the ogres had to resort to eating one another just because things were pretty rough. And where the meteor itself had landed, a massive hole had been bored into the ground. Basically, peeking down into it, you couldn't see anything. It went further than the eye could see. But more than that, as the ogres peered down into the massive hole in the ground, they realized that this was no hole. This wasn't just a mere crater. For craters do not move. Craters do not possess teeth. This place became known as the Great Maw, and it imprinted itself psychically upon all ogres everywhere. And so the ogres as a species have become afflicted by this insatiable curse, this desire to forever feed, this hunger that can never be satisfied. And this is more than just a physical sensation, this has taken on a religious tone for the ogres. This actually influenced the ogre society so much that there's no actual word in the ogre language for dead, but there are dozens for the word eaten. So yeah, pretty hungry guys is what I'm saying. They're basically my spirit animal. And so with the maw writhing around in that big crater, whatever it was, the ogres left. They began an exodus where they spread out like a disease across the world. Now, power in ogre society is denoted by size. So the fatter the ogre, the more he has eaten, and therefore the more powerful he is. It's pretty great logic, actually. It makes total sense. Now, generally speaking, leaders of ogres are known as tyrants, but there is only one ogre who has the title of over-tyrant, the tyrant of all tyrants. And that ogre is known as Greasus Goldtooth, or to give him his full and proper title, okay, stick with me here, the Trade Lord, Greasus, Tribe Stealer, Drake Crush, Gate Crusher, Hordemaster, Goldtooth, the shockingly obese. What a guy. A title that could almost certainly not fit in a single tweet. So he is by far the largest and most powerful ogre tyrant that has ever existed. And he basically travels around on a massive palanquin held up by hundreds of little Noblar slaves. These are a little race of goblins that have been enslaved by the ogres. And basically his whole thing is that he's never going to rest while there is something in the world that remains uneaten. He is greed incarnate, so basically a big picture guy. The ogres are fun. The ogres are fun. Now, another big character, pun intended, in the ogre faction is maybe not as big as Greasus Goldtooth, but he is no less terrifying. He is known as Scrag the Slaughterer. So, lovely guy, totally crazy. And he has replaced his hands with blades. So let's not talk about the bathroom situation, but we'll work out how he got there. Now, this guy is the most devoted to the worship of the Great Maw out of any other ogres. In fact, he is so devoted that he is often referred to as the Maw that walks. Not really a compliment. Now, his hands were originally removed by a tyrant that he had offended, and then he was chucked in a big cavern and a big boulder was rolled in front of it so that he couldn't escape. This practice isn't unique. This is actually done pretty on the regular in ogre society, especially to the smaller, more weedier ogres. They're often thrown into caverns amongst each other, and basically they're left to fend for themselves, with the only food in the cavern being each other. And so basically, you know, they eat one another until only the craziest survive. Then they come out of the cavern known as gorgers, and they're basically monsters at that stage, just these lanky, kind of feral creatures. They come out weird. Now, Scrag found himself beset on all sides by these gorgers in a big cavern. And so he did what any right-thinking ogre would do. He basically stuck blades in his arm stumps and got the chopping, got the cooking, oh boy. And this managed to actually earn the respect of the rest of the gorgers in the cavern, so together they escaped. So it's a good story, it has a happy ending. Of course, once they did escape, they devoured their previous tribe, but you know, I mean, those guys were assholes. So then, those are the two bigger leaders for the ogres, so you can see that they're a fun people. Basically, Gordon Ramsay as a species if he was let off the chain. We know people have signed NDAs denying them from admitting certain events. Now, bear in mind that a single adult ogre is basically the strength equivalent of a dozen men, and you can see how these guys can be kind of problems. That's pretty terrifying, but throw on top of that, these ogres have guns. And I'm not talking about just like little, like a 9mm pistol, this massive guy around. No, they run around with huge cannons. They carry cannons, and they're called lead belchers because they eat bullets. These guys are hardcore. But they also have plenty of heavy armor, so if you wanted to face off against one of these guys, you know, and we're like, plenty of flesh, well, covered in heavy armor now. And they also have, if that was not enough, they also have a huge list, a huge menagerie of enslaved animals and races at their beck and call. So these range from the aforementioned nobblers, the goblin creatures, but then we've also got the gigantic Mournfangs, which are large enough for ogres to ride about on. But also giants, who were once a very noble, very well looked after race of giants who used to command the world, have now been debased and enslaved by the ogres. And then you've also got basically creatures like the Gorgers, which are at this stage essentially a whole other thing. They're not quite normal ogres anymore. So yeah, they got a lot going on. And it must, of course, also be mentioned that ogres aren't big and dumb and slow. Far from it. They're actually terrifyingly quick. And they're really cunning as well. They make for brilliant mercenaries because you can just pay them in food, and they are often working as mercenaries throughout the world. But the thing you have to watch out for ogres is that they are more than likely driven by whatever malign intelligence resides in the Great Maw. So whatever it wants, the ogres want too. So don't underestimate them. And next up we have Grand Cathay, which are a little bit difficult to talk about. There wasn't really a lot going on for them in Warhammer Fantasy originally. Obviously, they've gotten a lot of press recently from Total War Warhammer 3. They're a fully playable faction in that game, and they will very likely be in the Old World Miniatures game by Games Workshop in the next couple of years. But historically speaking, there hasn't been a lot to go on there. There's a little bit of history that we're aware of, but in terms of miniatures, they were never released. So Cathay itself is a mysterious place far removed from the Western world by a lot of hostile terrain. Now, Cathay is basically fantasy China, and they are, broadly speaking, a bit of an Orientalist perspective, but I'm just gonna give them to you as they are traditionally here, because they represent everything from the Xia to the Manchu dynasty in China, so very, very broad. Now, this land is ruled by the Dragon Emperor. The Dragon Emperor. Okay, remember that. Because this is not just a title. So earlier I mentioned that the ogres themselves had a meteor probably called on them by the Dragon Emperor of Cathay. And the reason that it's important to remember that is that the Dragon Emperor from then, in ancient history, is the same Dragon Emperor as today. It's the same guy. Same being, shall we say. Because Cathay has been ruled over by the same two entities for the last thousands of years. You have the Dragon Emperor and the Moon Goddess. And while they both have magical powers, they're both divine beings, they reject any and all worship, unlike, say, Sigmar in the Empire. So they do demand respect as rulers. I mean, they rule Cathay itself, but they don't require material worship. They don't require religious worship. And so as a result, a type of ancestor worship has flourished in Cathay. Now, that's not to say that the Dragon Emperor and the Moon Goddess have not had issues. There was the rise of a person called the Monkey King, who tried to become the de facto ruler of Cathay and started a rebellion. It's hinted at that this is some sort of chaos beastman of some kind, but we really don't know a lot about them. Now, militarily, Cathay have a massive standing army. And of course, being ruled by the Dragon King and the Moon Goddess means that they have a lot of power that they can bring to bear as well. But more than that, they also have dragon-blooded wizards who are said to be able to command fires that are hotter even than that from the flames of Asqui, which is the realm of fire that the traditional wizards of the Empire would tap into. And one of the most striking warriors that Cathay can bring to bear are the Terracotta Sentinels as well. And these are, of course, a real-world parallel to the Terracotta Soldiers found in the first Emperor of China's tomb. So Cathay are unique in the sense that they are the first faction in Total War to really have been made out of whole cloth. And they have been designed completely from the ground up, it seems, by Creative Assembly as opposed to just Games Workshop. I mean, no doubt there's been a lot of collaboration there. So it'll be interesting to see how much of Cathay from the video games will be translated into the Old World Miniatures game, because without a doubt, Cathay are going to make it into the Old World's Miniatures game, in my opinion. But that's the thing, we haven't seen them on the tabletop ever. I mean, maybe Okay, maybe there was like some very obscure versions of them back in the day, but Cathay and Nippon, these factions have never really truly been explored except outside of fan creations. So I guess in order to see how they might work in the future in terms of tabletop, you'll want to play Total War Warhammer 3, so I guess go check that out. Although if you're watching this video, more than likely you have some intention or awareness of that game. Okay, and now we have Chaos. Oh boy. Okay, so this is the whole thing. So Chaos are a little bit funky. There are 4 main gods of Chaos. And overall they are cruel and evil divine beings who feed on human emotion. And they are powered by certain concepts. So they exist out of time and space, but there are many mortals who worship them. And unlike a lot of other gods, they're not too cool for school. They do in fact take an interest in mortal affairs. Why is it always the evil ones? And they can even manifest on the mortal plane, or at the very least their avatars can. And they can also send hordes and hordes and hordes of demonic legions into the mortal realms as well. Like seriously, these demons are endless. Now most of the mortals who worship Chaos hail from the north, around the North Pole, and this is where the barrier between worlds is at its weakest. And the Chaos gods will even reward their followers with gifts for those who are the most dutiful. So, you know, you can get something like, say, a massive tentacle for an arm, which to me has never felt like really much of a reward so much as a bit of a setback. I think I'd prefer the hand, thanks. But also, culturally speaking, some of the strongest warriors of Chaos will be allowed to don what are known as the Hell-Forged Armor. This is a set of Chaos armor that the warrior can never leave ever again. They will become bound and one with this suit of armor. And this transforms them from mere mortal men into a living weapon. Space Marines, eat your heart out. These guys tower over the other tribal warriors that make up the Warriors of Chaos. And they often carry big, massive, f***off weapons. They're pretty badass is my point. Although I don't think, in terms of a practical sense, whether or not I'd really be up for living in a suit of armor. But these guys seem to be up for it. So that's the general idea of Chaos. That's where the mortals come in. They're often just tribes of Norskins who live in the north who worship Chaos and then are sent by the gods down south in order to prey upon their more civilized foes. Although that said, it's not only in the north that Chaos is worshipped, they also are worshipped in the east. Basically, barbarian tribes are typically the ones who would worship Chaos. And I mentioned at the beginning that there are 4 different Chaos gods, so we're gonna go through each one of them now individually because each one of them has a different theme and tone. And it's important that we don't bundle all the Chaos gods up together as just a single unified faction because they're not really. They at best have a rivalry with one another and at worst have a blood feud. It's really just their unified goal of devouring the world that kind of keeps them in order. So the first god we're going to talk about is Khorne. I want to talk about Khorne. No, the other Khorne. Okay, so no doubt you have already heard the immortal words, blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Khorne is violence and murder. He is rage and bloodshed. He lurks behind every reddened face, every clenched jaw, every raised fist. So he is fed and nourished by war, for it is all that Khorne desires. Winning the fight for Khorne is almost a disappointment because that means that the fighting is over. So from his great brass throne on a mountain of skulls, he observes all conflict that it takes place in the old world. Now, interestingly, all forms of conflict fall under Khorne's remit. So for example, the honorable soldier who fights for glory is also going to feed Khorne. Same as the barbarian that spills blood for, the fun of it as well. Khorne is the god of bloodshed. He doesn't care why the blood is being shed. He's not that kind of thinker. He just cares that, there's enough blood. Blood quota, gotta get reached. That's Khorne's thing. He doesn't care why the blood's there. Why would he ask such silly questions? So while all warriors worship Khorne to some extent by accident, the ones that explicitly do so are usually found among the Norskins. Now, armies of Khorne are pretty ferocious to behold. The common warrior of Khorne has usually been infused by a little bit of Khorne's power. They usually stand a little bit taller, stronger than other mortals. And those who have inherited Khorne's fever are known as the Chosen, and they typically stand even bigger and taller than others even in their own armies, and are usually clad in black and red armor. Now the fury and speed of these warriors is supernatural, and you might have seen some of them before called berserkers, and these guys are crazy. Every second without violence to them is it's just a big problem. They need to resolve that situation ASAP. And so they do, they resolve that situation with their big axes. They like violence. Now you also get a lot of demons as well who fight on behalf of Khorne. Now these demons can take many forms, but typically speaking they are always direct, very to the point. They're very explicit and very violent. You get plenty of warhounds, but then you also get these demons, this is kind of like the main foot soldier, they're called bloodletters, and they're like little devil guys with swords. I don't know how best to describe them. And they got big tongues. I don't know how else to describe these guys. These guys are the rank and file. They're pretty bloodthirsty. Now, worse than all of these are what's known as the greater demons of Khorne. The ones that are made in his image. They are known as the bloodthirsters. These guys are massive winged, hooved monstrosities, is the only way to put it. And they wield a huge axe that is the size of buildings. And like their master, they are fueled only by violence and murder and anger and rage. And they are basically invulnerable so long as blood continues to be shed. So how do you fight these guys? Probably with cannon, I think. That's what I would do. Now the most notable bloodthirster is known as Skarbrand. This is once Khorne's most devoted servant. However, he was manipulated by one of the other Chaos Gods into striking Khorne across the face. Got like a bitch slap. Now obviously Khorne wasn't hurt at all, because of course not, because it's Khorne. Khorne is a Chaos God, not your bitch. So Khorne then, in his fury, strangled Skarbrand. Very random. And then he cast him into exile, so the strangling presumably didn't kill him. It was a light strangling. Now to this day, Skarbrand continues to, rampage in absolute anger and vitriol. And to be honest, Skarbrand himself doesn't remember any of this. He doesn't know why he's so angry all the time. He just is angry all the time. So that's him, that's his thing now. And because of that, he's actually now the perfect servant of Khorne. Nothing but rage and anger. So, there's a little bit of a love-hate relationship going on here. And next up we have Nurgle, lovely Nurgle. So Nurgle is the oldest of the Chaos Gods, because for as long as life has existed, it has needed to die. And all death feeds the Plague Lord, Nurgle. Now it's not murder like his little brother Khorne, it's more just death. Now in addition to death and disease, life, regeneration are also within his purview. Nurgle as a god has a very oddly cheerful disposition when compared to the other Chaos Gods. In fact, he loves the world and he views his plagues and diseases as gifts. So this is obviously pretty strange for a Chaos God, but he has earned the very affectionate nickname of Papa Nurgle. Or as I prefer to call him, Big Daddy Nurgs. Now he is usually depicted as a bloated, fat creature oozing and pussing out of many, many wounds. And, covered in flies as well, of course. And he basically births new diseases and feeds them to the world like a really evil Santa Claus. In fact, it is thought that all the diseases in the world are on his body or in his body somewhere. So we know who to blame for COVID then. Now, even the followers of Grandfather Nurgle are called to do battle. And when they are on the battlefield, it's always going to be a protracted and really, really, really unpleasant affair for everyone involved. So all of the soldiers are blighted beyond recognition. They're all diseased. The gifts that Nurgle likes to give out are diseases and plagues. So, if you are a worshipper of Nurgle, then you're gonna get plenty of diseases. But don't worry, he just makes it not that they don't do the damage to your body or make you all weird looking. He makes it so that you don't mind that part. So it's sort of a gift. And of course, he also has his chosen, as all the other Chaos Gods do. And his chosen are basically just really, tenacious. They're almost impossible to put down because they are so bloated and monstrous. Now, the smallest of the Nurgle demons are known as the Nurglings, which is a really fun word. These are little tiny creatures that basically move like a tide. They crawl and slither across everything that they come across. And they sort of emerge from the greater demons of Nurgle, which are known as the Great Unclean Ones. And they are also made in the image of their father. So basically these huge, bloated, festering monsters with loads of wounds, with all these different diseases all oozing out of them. And they got mouths in their bellies, and like blood pussing out that just, you know, destroys the landscape that it touches. It's just really not a good time. If you've ever seen the Abomination from Warcraft, they were heavily inspired by the Great Unclean Ones. Now, the most notable of Nurgle's followers is a Great Unclean One, and it's known as Kurgath the Plague Father. And his whole thing is that basically he wants to create a disease that will infect gods as well. So, I mean, he's aiming high. Good for him. Unfortunately, in canon, he never got to achieve this because during the end times, Luin Leoncoeur, the king of Bretonnia, struck him down. So that's kind of sad. Watching a dream die, you know, it's just not good. And all right, finally, we're here. We're with Slaanesh, the protagonist of the setting. I could go into a lot of detail about what Slaanesh is. I've got plenty of notes here, but I think the easiest way to describe Slaanesh is basically to say that they are the god. Now, they are the youngest god of all the Chaos gods, and they are basically the hedonist god. They are the lord of all earthly pleasures. Basically what Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for. Basically decadence in all its forms are the purview of the Lord of Excess. So let's just be real straight here, let's be honest. If we had to worship a Chaos god, I mean, it would be, right? Look, I mean, Beastman and Kinky Boots, come on. Now, Slaanesh kind of worms their way into you in very sort of subtle ways sometimes. So they are present in the brushstrokes of the frenzied artist, or in the butterflies before first kiss, or in the fisting of a massive hooker, or, you know, in the exquisite flaying of a servant's back. So it's easy to see why worship of Slaanesh flourishes among the upper echelons of many societies, especially considering that these tend to make up the individuals unbound by conscience or, you know, restraint. So corruption from Slaanesh usually does begin pretty simply, you know, an extra glass of wine here, a feast or a secret tryst with a friend or family member, until, you know, that's not quite enough. It doesn't quite satisfy you. So you push it a little bit further and further and further until, you know, you're in a donkey show. So worshippers of Slaanesh basically push things to greater extremes until it goes too far. Essentially, you know, until they can't push any further. There's no further beyond they can go, so they have to go to their prince, to Slaanesh. So when the Slaaneshi go to battle, their true natures shine brilliantly. While Khorne delights in slaughter and Nurgle in death, Slaanesh's ecstasy is in the screaming agony and anguish of the participants of battle. Their warriors carry barbed and bladed weapons that are more designed to maim than kill. They prefer to disable their foes with excruciating pain more than anything else, because it is all about sensation to them. It is all about the thrill. The slowest Slaaneshi demons are the demonettes, and they wield an illusory beauty. However, in reality, they are basically, you know, crab people. They've got massive claws. Everything wants to be a crab. And even more otherworldly are the fiends. These are hideous chimeras of human, lizard, and arachnid. Slaaneshi too has a greater demon, which is known as the Keeper of Secrets. These are the Eaters of Desire, and no two look alike. Save for the fact that they all have multiple appendages and eyes that shine like jewels. To see one of them is to become utterly obsessed with their image for the rest of your life. I mean, they look okay, I guess. I don't see it. Now, the most notable follower of Slaanesh has got to be Prince Sigvald the Magnificent. His appearance belies the depths of depravity inherent within his soul. He is radiant and beautiful, and always accompanied by his mirror guard, who wield shields of polished glass, such that he can always see himself whilst in battle. You could say he's a little self-absorbed. The start of his descent into depravity began when he got a taste for human flesh. He got the hunger. And in more recent times, he razed a city to the ground because he broke a nail there. So he's a man after my own heart. Also, he wears assless chaps. And last but not least, we have Tzeentch. Now, Tzeentch is arguably the closest to the concept of chaos out of all the four chaos gods. He is basically aligned with the concept of change. Magic and knowledge are his purview, both things he guards really jealously. He is spiteful, capricious, and always scheming. No other god can grasp his machinations, so what hope do mortals have? Now, some believe that he weaves fate itself. All wizards in the world unknowingly feed Tzeentch, for it is from the realms of chaos that the winds of magic blow. And it is for this reason that all wizards in the world of Warhammer are mostly distrusted and viewed suspiciously. And magic is so dangerous in the world because you always have a risk of accidentally summoning something that you don't want. Or, alternatively, you might accidentally attract the attention of Tzeentch, and Tzeentch will just snatch you, just pull you right into the void as you scream. So be careful when hiring a magician for an 8-year-old's party. That's just my suggestion. Now, Tzeentch holds really great temptation over his followers because magic and knowledge are so valuable in the world. And unlike the other Chaos gods, it's basically impossible to divine Tzeentch's motives. And so to worship him is basically to worship the very concept of fickleness. So it's the algorithm then, it's the YouTube algorithm. Now, Tzeentch's armies command the greatest wizards that the world has ever seen because his power just flows directly and freely to them. His Forsaken are heavily mutated chaos worshippers. Their bodies are warped and changed by his power. Then he also has the Shapeless Horrors as well, who fill his ranks, and no two of them look the same, and they're always changing how they look. Although obviously graphical limitations on miniatures and things like that will mean that they look kind of the same thing, but in the fluff, they're always changing. I mean, in the games, they look like little balls with arms and legs. And they can basically bathe their enemies in just fire of chaos. His greater demon is the Lord of Change, who's a massive bird-like entity. Basically this huge, terrifying spellcaster. Caw-caw! And it's as cruel and manipulative as its master. And it is said that when a Lord of Change gazes upon a mortal, they see their form, their hopes, their dreams, and their future. For me, my hope is to not be eaten by a Lord of Change, so hopefully they pay attention to that. Now, the most notable of the Tzeentch worshippers is Kairos Fateweaver, who is a Lord of Change. They are a two-headed monstrosity whose heads perceive both the past and the future with perfect clarity. Kairos basically spent many years in a magical epicenter known as the Well of Eternity, and since then has become completely blind to the present. So, swings and roundabouts. But apparently he's been gifted with secrets beyond even the ken of his master Tzeentch, so, there you go. Not too bad. Okay, and finally we have Chaos Undivided. So as I previously mentioned, the Chaos gods mostly despise one another. So when they get together and they all agree on a single champion that will represent them, it's a big deal. It's a big, massive deal. And once every couple of 100 years or so, someone does show up who shines so brightly as to attract all of their attention. All 4 of their attention. And this person becomes known as the Ever-Chosen, which is to say a champion of Chaos Undivided. And the current incarnation of this is Archaon, the Lord of the End Times. He is the herald of the apocalypse, and the war he waged on the old world was such that Sigmar himself had to come down to the planet in order to fight the guy. And the fight was such that the world itself ended. Sigmar actually lost in the fight with Archaon. So that is all the factions in Total War Warhammer 3. Woohoo! There is a lot to each of these guys, but I hope that I provided a nice broad overview for each one of them. And my lungs are about to give out, so I can't go any further. But do join me for part 2, where I'll be covering some more factions from Warhammer Fantasy. And a big thanks to my patrons. You can see them on the screen right now. And I want to give an extra special shout out to the Space Marine captains, Stephen Jackson and Earthwormia, who are really, supporting the channel. It's brilliant, thank you. And so I shall catch y'all next time. Bye bye! Games Workshop Delenda Est.